Right now, in your kitchen, there is probably more food than an entire Ice Age tribe would see in a month. And yet somehow, without refrigerators, without supermarkets, and without a single can of preserved food, our ancestors survived famines that lasted for years. Some of these famines were so severe that entire landscapes turned to dust, rivers dried into cracked mud, and the animals people hunted simply vanished. Modern humans today panic when a grocery store shelf is empty for a single afternoon. So how did people with no modern tools survive when the food disappeared for months, sometimes for years at a time? The answer involves buried knowledge, strange survival foods, secret social rules, and a kind of collective memory that most of us have completely lost. By the end of this video, you will understand the hidden famine survival system that kept our species alive through ice ages, droughts, and total ecological collapse. You will also learn why some of the strangest ancient customs, the ones that look wasteful or bizarre to modern eyes, were actually brilliant famine insurance policies in disguise. Famine was not a rare event in ancient life. It was a recurring and expected part of the yearly cycle in many regions. Archaeologists studying ancient skeletons have found growth interruptions in bones and teeth, physical proof that childhood hunger was common across many prehistoric populations. These interruptions are called Harris lines and enamel hypoplasia, and they act like tree rings, recording periods when a body simply stopped growing due to lack of food. Researchers who study these ancient bones estimate that many hunter-gatherer children experienced at least one serious food shortage before reaching adulthood. This means the pressure to solve the problem of famine was not occasional, it was constant, and it shaped nearly every tradition ancient people passed down. Later in this video, I will explain the secret food category that ancient people relied on that most modern humans have never even heard of. I will also explain why certain rituals that look like superstition today were actually early warning systems for environmental disaster. And I will show you the social rule that mattered more than any tool, weapon, or skill when real famine finally arrived. Let's start with the biggest myth about ancient famine survival, the idea that people simply starved quietly until the food came back. In reality, ancient communities had an entire hidden category of food that they only touched during true emergencies. Anthropologists call these emergency resources famine foods, and almost every traditional culture on Earth had its own specific version of them. In parts of Africa, communities relied on certain tree barks and wild tubers that were mildly toxic and required careful preparation to remove poison before eating. In parts of Europe, people ground up acorns, chestnuts, and even tree bark into a rough flour when grain harvests failed completely. In the Arctic, indigenous groups relied on stored fat reserves from marine animals, since fat could be preserved far longer than meat in extreme cold. These famine foods were rarely delicious, and they often required extra labor to prepare safely, which is exactly why people avoided eating them in normal times. Communities passed down detailed instructions, usually through oral storytelling, about which plants were safe once processed correctly, and which ones remained deadly no matter what. This knowledge had to be perfect, because a single mistake in preparing a toxic root could kill an entire family instead of saving it. Imagine a small group of foragers walking for hours through a drought-stricken landscape, searching for any plant their grandparents once mentioned surviving on. They finally locate a patch of wild tubers that their elders described as bitter and dangerous, but survivable if boiled multiple times in fresh water. They spend the entire evening boiling, discarding water, and boiling again, exactly as they were taught, because skipping even one step could poison the whole group. This is not a rare dramatic scene. This was ordinary survival behavior repeated across countless famine seasons throughout human prehistory. But here's what most people don't realize. Famine foods were only the backup plan. The real survival strategy started long before the crisis began. The deeper strategy was something researchers call risk buffering, and it explains almost everything strange about ancient social customs. Risk buffering means spreading your survival chances across many different sources, so that if one source fails, you are not left with nothing. Hunter-gatherer groups did this by maintaining strong social ties with distant groups, even ones they only saw once or twice a year. These distant alliances were maintained through gift-giving, shared rituals, marriage between groups, and long seasonal gatherings that look like celebration but function like insurance. Anthropologists studying groups such as the Juhonsi of the Kalahari Desert found an elaborate gift exchange system called Hechero, built almost entirely around future survival. Under this system, a person would give tools, beads, or food to a friend in a distant camp, expecting nothing in return immediately. Years later, if their own region suffered drought or lost its animal herds, that same friend was now obligated to host and feed them. In other words, generosity in good times was not just kindness, it was a long-term contract against future starvation. This explains why so many ancient cultures placed enormous social pressure on sharing food, even when a hunter had barely enough for his own family. Refusing to share was often treated as a serious social offense, not because of pure morality, but because uncooperative people threatened the entire group's survival system. There's something even stranger almost nobody talks about, and it involves the social status of the people who controlled food distribution during a crisis. In many ancient societies, the person who decided how food was rationed during famine held enormous temporary power, sometimes more than a chief or war leader. Researchers studying famine periods in traditional agricultural societies found that these food distribution roles often shifted to elders, especially elder women with deep memory of past crises. These elders remembered which wild plants had saved the community decades earlier, which neighboring groups could be trusted, and which mistakes had caused deaths in the past. This stored knowledge inside a single elder's memory was sometimes more valuable to group survival than any weapon, tool, or physical skill. When an elder died without passing on this knowledge, entire communities could lose decades of hard-earned famine wisdom in a single generation. This is likely one of the real reasons ancient cultures treated elders with such deep respect. Their memory was quite literally a survival technology. Now let's talk about something modern science only recently began to appreciate: the biological adaptations our ancestors evolved specifically to survive repeated famine. Researchers studying human metabolism have proposed what is called the thrifty gene hypothesis, the idea that certain populations evolved to store fat extremely efficiently after feast periods. This theory suggests that people who could rapidly convert extra food into fat reserves had a survival advantage whenever famine struck unpredictably. While this hypothesis remains debated among scientists, it lines up with something anthropologists observe directly. Many traditional societies had strong cultural rituals encouraging deliberate overeating after a successful hunt. A large kill, such as a mammoth or bison, was often eaten in an intense communal feast rather than rationed slowly over many weeks. This looks wasteful to modern eyes, since spreading the meat out longer seems like it should keep people fed for a longer stretch of time. But in a world without refrigeration, meat rotted quickly no matter what, so eating quickly and sharing widely built social debt instead of wasting the meat entirely. By feasting together and creating obligations across the group, people were essentially storing the meat's value inside relationships instead of inside a container. This is a completely different survival logic than modern thinking. Ancient humans often stored favors and trust rather than storing food itself. Let's move now to one of the most overlooked famine survival tools in human history: seasonal migration timed around environmental memory. Long before written calendars existed, ancient groups tracked incredibly precise seasonal patterns passed down through songs, stories, and star observation. Aboriginal Australian communities developed intricate songlines, oral maps encoded in song that described exact travel routes tied to water sources and seasonal food availability. These songlines allowed people to move confidently across vast, harsh landscapes, arriving at specific water holes or plant patches at precisely the right moment each year. If a group forgot even a single verse of these songs, they risked arriving at a location too early or too late, missing the narrow survival window entirely. This means oral tradition was not just cultural storytelling, it was literally a survival GPS system encoded in rhythm and memory. Similar systems existed among many nomadic and semi-nomadic cultures worldwide, from Arctic reindeer herders to Central Asian steppe pastoralists tracking grazing cycles. Later in this video, I will explain how ritual practices, the kind that look purely religious today, actually functioned as early warning systems for environmental danger. But first, let's examine a famine survival strategy hiding inside something most people think of as pure superstition: taboo food restrictions. Many ancient cultures had strict rules forbidding certain foods during specific seasons or life stages, rules that seemed mysterious or purely spiritual on the surface. Anthropologists studying these taboos found that a surprising number of them protected fragile animal or plant populations from being overhunted during vulnerable breeding periods. For example, some coastal cultures forbade eating certain fish species during their spawning season, ensuring the population could recover and provide food again next year. If people had eaten those spawning fish freely, short-term hunger might have been solved, but long-term food supply would have collapsed within a few short years. By wrapping this practical ecological rule inside spiritual or religious language, elders made sure the rule was followed consistently, even when logic alone might not convince a hungry person. This is a powerful insight. Some of the strangest ancient religious rules were actually sophisticated resource management strategies disguised as sacred law. Now, here's a mini scenario worth imagining. Picture a coastal village facing its third year of poor fish returns in a row. The village elder reminds everyone of the old taboo, insisting that a certain deep channel remains untouched no matter how desperate people become. Younger hunters argue that breaking the taboo could feed the village immediately, since fish are visibly present in that forbidden channel. But the elder holds firm, remembering a story passed down about a village generations earlier that broke this same rule and lost its entire fish supply permanently. This tension between short-term survival and long-term thinking appears again and again throughout famine-era history, and elders were usually the ones enforcing the longer view. Modern fisheries scientists have since confirmed that many traditional taboo systems functioned as remarkably effective, if unintentional, conservation strategies long before the word conservation existed. Let's shift now to a topic that connects directly to your own body today: the physiological changes your ancestors' bodies went through during real famine. When food intake drops severely, the human body enters a state researchers call metabolic adaptation, slowing its own processes to conserve every available calorie. Historical famine studies, including detailed research following the Dutch hunger winter of 1944, revealed lasting effects of famine on both metabolism and even future generations. Children born to mothers who experienced severe famine during pregnancy showed altered metabolic patterns decades later, evidence that famine's effects can echo far beyond a single lifetime. This means the famines your ancestors survived may still be quietly shaping biological patterns present in populations today, even without a single famine occurring in living memory. There's something even stranger almost nobody talks about. The psychological toughness famine survival required may have shaped deep cultural values still present in many societies. Anthropologists studying famine-prone regions have noted cultural emphasis on frugality, food-sharing customs, and distrust of waste, patterns that persisted long after famine risk had actually decreased. In other words, some of your grandparents' strict attitudes about finishing your plate or never wasting food may be cultural echoes of genuine famine survival lessons. These are not random personality quirks. They are inherited behavioral patterns shaped by thousands of years of real starvation risk passed down through cultural transmission. Now, let's talk about one of the most fascinating famine survival innovations in human history: early food preservation and storage technology. Long before refrigeration, ancient peoples developed remarkably effective preservation methods, including drying, smoking, salting, fermenting, and burying food in cold ground or ice. Archaeological sites across the Arctic revealed deep meat caches, essentially natural underground freezers, used by ancient peoples to store surplus food for lean winter months. Fermentation, now trendy in modern kitchens, was originally a famine survival technology, allowing vegetables, dairy, and grains to last through entire seasons without spoiling. This is why food preparation knowledge was rarely trusted to just anyone. It was often controlled and taught carefully by specific respected members of the community. Let's revisit an earlier open loop now: the question of how rituals functioned as early warning systems for environmental danger. Many traditional cultures held seasonal ceremonies tied closely to specific environmental signs, such as bird migrations, plant flowering, or star positions in the night sky. If these expected signs failed to appear on schedule, elders often interpreted this as a warning that the coming season might bring scarcity. Communities would respond by tightening food rationing early, sending scouts to distant regions, or reinforcing alliances with neighboring groups sooner than usual. In this way, ritual observation functioned almost like a primitive early warning meteorological system, built entirely on careful, repeated environmental observation across generations. Modern climate scientists studying indigenous knowledge systems have found genuine predictive value hidden inside many of these traditional environmental indicators. This suggests something remarkable. Ancient rituals were not simply superstition. They often encoded generations of careful ecological data disguised inside sacred practice. Let's return now to the human body itself, and a particular survival adaptation many people find surprising: the way hunger itself changes human behavior and decision-making. Researchers studying the Minnesota starvation experiment during the 1940s observed volunteers becoming intensely focused on food, sometimes to the point of losing interest in almost everything else. This heightened food focus likely mirrors an ancient survival instinct, since intense attention toward finding and remembering food sources would have been essential during real famine conditions. Ancient famine survivors likely experienced this same shift, becoming hyper-attentive to any possible food source, no matter how small or unusual it's. This explains why famine folklore across many cultures includes detailed knowledge of extremely minor food sources, insects, lichens, certain barks, and otherwise ignored plants. In parts of Scandinavia, communities historically consumed a bread made partly from ground pine bark during severe famine years, a practice now studied by food historians. This bark bread was not tasty, and it provided limited nutrition, but it added crucial bulk and calories when true starvation was the alternative. Similar bark-based famine foods appear in the historical record across Russia, Finland, and parts of North America during severe crop. This tells us something profound. Ancient humans were willing to eat almost anything digestible when the alternative was death, and cultural memory preserved exactly how to do it safely. Let's talk now about cooperation on a larger scale, because individual knowledge alone rarely explains full community famine survival. Archaeologists and anthropologists studying famine resilience across cultures consistently find one pattern standing out above all others. Strong social cooperation consistently predicted survival more than any single technology. Communities with strong sharing norms, wide social networks, and trusted alliances across distant regions consistently fared better during famine than isolated, self-reliant groups. This finding challenges a common modern myth, the idea of the tough, self-sufficient survivalist facing the wilderness completely alone. In reality, ancient famine survival depended overwhelmingly on relationships, obligations, and trust built carefully over years, long before any crisis actually began. A lone hunter, no matter how skilled, could not outsurvive an entire drought or crop failure without support from a wider social. This is perhaps the single most important insight modern audiences can take from studying ancient famine survival. Cooperation was the true technology, not individual toughness. Before we bring everything together, there is one more overlooked famine strategy worth understanding: the deliberate diversification of food sources across an entire landscape. Ancient communities rarely relied on a single food source, even when one particular resource seemed abundant and reliable most of the year. Anthropologists studying traditional diets have found that many hunter-gatherer groups regularly use dozens, sometimes over 100, different plant and animal species across a single year. This wide diversity acted as a natural insurance policy, since a disease or drought affecting one species rarely affected every single food source at the same time. Farming societies, once agriculture developed, faced a very different and often more dangerous famine risk because they increasingly depended on just one or two staple crops. Historians studying famous historical famines, including the Irish potato famine of the 1840s, point to this dangerous over-reliance on a single crop as a major contributor. When that single staple crop failed due to disease, entire populations that had abandoned diverse foraging diets had almost no fallback food sources remaining. This is a striking pattern throughout history. Societies with more diverse, flexible diets generally weathered famine far better than societies locked into a single dominant crop. Trade networks added another crucial layer of protection, allowing surplus food from one region to reach another region currently experiencing severe shortage. Archaeological evidence shows extensive trade routes existed even in prehistoric times, moving grain, dried fish, salt, and other preserved goods across surprisingly long distances. These trade relationships depended on the same foundation as the gift exchange systems mentioned earlier, years of built trust between communities that rarely interacted directly otherwise. A community known for breaking trade agreements or hoarding supplies during another region's crisis would quickly find itself abandoned when its own crisis eventually arrived. This created a powerful long-term incentive for honesty and generosity, since reputation itself functioned as a form of famine insurance stretching across generations. Let's bring this all together now and imagine one final scene, tying together everything you've learned throughout this video. Picture an ancient village enduring its second consecutive year of failed harvests, tension rising as stored grain reserves shrink dangerously low. The village elder calls a gathering, reminding everyone of the old famine foods, the distant allies who owe favors, and the sacred taboo still protecting the last fish spawning grounds. Younger members grumble about strict rationing, but ultimately follow the guidance passed down from generations who survived worse crises using exactly this same careful strategy. Messengers are sent to a distant allied camp, carrying gifts exchanged years earlier, now calling in that long-standing survival debt. Slowly, through shared knowledge, strict discipline, and deep social trust, the village survives the famine, just as their ancestors had survived countless famines before them. This story repeated itself in different forms across nearly every corner of the ancient world for hundreds of thousands of years. So let's return now to where we started, the overflowing modern kitchen most of us take completely for granted every single day. Our ancestors survived famine not through brute individual strength, but through stored knowledge, careful preservation, disguised ecological wisdom, and deep social cooperation. They remembered which plants could kill and which could save a life. They preserved food through ingenious ancient technology, and they built alliances designed specifically for crisis. They respected elders because memory itself was survival technology, and they enforced taboos that quietly protected fragile ecosystems long before modern science understood why. Perhaps the most important lesson from all of this is that survival was never really an individual achievement, it was always a deeply collective one. The next time you open a refrigerator full of food without a second thought, remember the extraordinary chain of knowledge and cooperation that allowed your ancestors to reach this exact moment in history. Their hunger, their discipline, and their hard-won wisdom is quite literally the reason you exist to watch this video today. If this glimpse into humanity's forgotten survival wisdom fascinated you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next deep dive into ancient knowledge and prehistoric life. There are many more forgotten stories like this one, stories about ancient medicine, lost rituals, and survival skills our ancestors mastered long before written history began.